Okay. So, good evening. Good evening. Welcome back for those of you who were here last night, and welcome to those of you who are joining us today. We're really happy to have you here. Tonight, we've actually convened a panel which is really focused on the latest empirical research in the field of digital media and learning. So, in addition to actually just trying to commemorate the very first digital media and learning conference, the focus of the session really emerged out of the recognition that we're at this moment where there's a great corpus of research that now enables us to really reflect upon and think critically about this transdisciplinary field as a whole. So this panel then is really an opportunity to reflect upon the empirical, theoretical, and methodological innovations that have emerged and have been driven by recent changes in media and technology, with an eye towards the directions that our current and future research may or should be going. So today we've invited a panel of 6 researchers who have really been at the forefront of defining this new wave of research on social media, youth practice, and social cultural learning to participate in what we're hoping will be an interactive panel. And we have this aim of facilitating a conversation about this moment, where we are, what to do next, what's missing, where should we be going. So we've asked each of the researchers on the panel to spend about 5 minutes summarizing all of their research. So we'll see how that goes. And the key research questions that have really been driving their work. And it's not a small task for those of us who are researchers, practitioners to do this. So I really appreciate their efforts in keeping things brief so that we can be more interactive. So then after the overview, which will be about 5 minutes each, 30 minutes, I'll be turning the session over to Mimi Ito, who will be moderating a discussion, and then we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. And we're sort of hoping to end about 6:30 because there's a shuttle bus at 6:45 that I'm sure many of you would like to be on after a very long day. So with that said, I'd like to introduce our first speaker today, Amanda Lenhart. So Amanda is a researcher at the Pew Center for Internet and American Life, and as many of you here know, Amanda has really led most of the major Pew studies on teens and social network sites, gaming, blogging, social media, I think recently mobile phones, and she's certainly someone that we have, in our research, looked to really map the overall landscape and the changing landscape of social media use among youth. So with that, is it not working? Okay. He said do view, then presenter. And then get on the Great.
So thanks, Heather. So today I thought I would talk, since we have 5 minutes to cover the landscape of research, I thought I would focus, actually sort of take a focus from Craig's talk last night and really look at our data, our most recent data on access to technology and networks, and then opportunities to kind of create and participate. And all this is said that our most recent research is really, this is kind of a sideways glance at this topic. Really what we're in the process of putting together is a large piece of research on youth and mobile phones. And this is a side piece that we released in advance of that, but that's partly why I think it's a little bit less complete than I might really have liked. So just to start us off, of course, again, 93% of teens 12 to 17 are going online. But families are now increasingly having broadband access. I know there was some talk last night about who had broadband access. So the top numbers, the top 4 bars, is about 76% of families that have broadband at home. That's a small increase from the last time we asked in 2008. But if you dig deeper into the numbers, low-income and low-education families still lag behind in broadband adoption. They're slightly over 50%. And African-American households lag behind white households. About 68% of African-American households have broadband, whereas close to 80% of white households do. So it's important to keep in mind that there are still some inequalities in pure access to the internet. And again, let's not even forget this 10% of dial-up users and then the approximately 12% of families that don't have any kind of net connection at home at all. It's also important to remember that there are different patterns of use. So beyond just this 93%, the frequency of internet use does vary. And I put up this, again, race and ethnicity variable because this is one of the starker differences. There's actually a fantastic graph on our site that I would commend to all of you. That's an interactive way of looking over time at how frequency of internet use has changed. And it looks at it in terms of race and in terms of family income. But really, and I'll let you look at this, but you can see that there's a much broader range of ways in which African American and to a lesser extent Hispanic youth go online, whereas whiter youth are more likely to go online more frequently. When we're thinking about access to technology, and particularly internet, obviously we have to think about cell phones, we have to think about mobile phones. Teens increasingly have them. It's about 73% of all teens who have them, and really the only ones who are lagging behind are the youngest teens at this point, the 12-year-olds and younger. And other than family income, there are no differences in who owns a cell phone. So a cell phone is that thing in your pocket, that connectivity in your pocket that supersedes a lot of the other differences that we have in who's going online. So again, as you can see, it's just the teens from the lowest income families who are less likely to have a cell phone. But this is my favorite slide, and we will actually be fleshing this data out further in our upcoming report. As Craig mentioned, there is some data that suggests that when looking at cell phone use and looking at cell phones to go online, that African Americans and Latinos, adults, are much more likely to use that device to go online than whites are. And that, in fact, I'll give you a preview, is borne out in our teens data as well. We will be releasing that in the next, hopefully, 2 months. So it's not included here in these slides today, but I'm happy to share that with you now as well. But I also thought it's interesting to note that there are also significant and substantial percentages of teens that are using gaming devices to go online as well. So it's not just the cell phone, and it's not just desktops and laptops. Another thing when we're talking more about opportunities for creativity, so we've talked a lot over the past couple of years about teens' enthusiasm for technology and using technology to create content. So we did a smaller subset of our activities this time and found that teens are still sharing content and remixing. But what these numbers don't reflect here is that this is a comparison with adults, but if you look over time, sharing content and remixing is flat. So there's been no increase in that at all in this period of time. And you need to contrast that with the fact that over this period of time, social network use has increased significantly and is now at 73% of teens who use it. So there's something going on here about content creating, whether we've hit some point at which we've found the sort of stable number of teens who will do something, or whether there is something about what we're showing them and what we're making available to them. We're not seeing the kinds of increases that we might expect. And even more perhaps worrisome if you think that blogging is a really great educational tool. We've seen pretty significant declines in blogging and in commenting on blogs over the past 3 years. Now, I think a lot of this has to do with moves in social networks and the fact that a lot of blogging was happening in social networking sites. MySpace put blogging front and center. Facebook does not. But I think this begs questions for all of us to think about, with this flatness and decline in some of these activities. Is it that they're moving to other activities that we're not measuring? Is it that they're doing them in different ways? Or is it that the fact that we're not presenting these activities in easy and seamless ways to do them that is sort of pulling teens away into other things that they're doing? So I'm going to stop here since I'm running out of time, but I leave you with a few of these questions, and obviously we'll explore them further in this panel. Thanks.
So that was actually 4 minutes and 45 seconds. So that was impressive. So next I'd like to introduce Brighid Baron, who is at the School of Education at Stanford University. I think many of us in this room know her and have really built upon and appreciated her work over the years. Her work looks at the social aspects of learning and learning environments, and she's really led the way in terms of developing new hybrid models of studying young people's learning ecologies that have both quantitative and qualitative dimensions. So I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to take that extra minute, I think, that Amanda didn't use. So like many of us at this conference, our research group has been working on developing answers to the who, what, where, why, and how questions about digital media production activities. We're interested in production activities where learning is driven by a desire to create what one imagines. So for example, the activity this child is engaged in making a film using toys, a stop animation Intel camera, and a computer that can run the software. Or, as shown in this image, a child authoring and illustrating an original story using simple software found at a community-based drop-in center. Or what this young woman is involved in, developing media assets to use in her behind-the-scenes showcase of her musical performance process, which she'll post to a website. So most of what we study would be classified as examples of the geeking out genre that Mimi and colleagues identified. And we're working on trying to understand when this kind of activity is consequential and for what, as well as who gets involved. So relevant to a question that was raised last night after the keynote, our data is beginning to show that the depth of production experience a young person develops matters for their sense of empowerment. And that was the question last night. Their perception of their capability with tools, their belief that they are creative, and sometimes even their ideas about their future lives as learners, workers, and creators. So the question of where learning is happening is really important if we care about broadening participation. This diagram actually comes from the Life Center. There's a couple other Life Center leads in this room, Reed Stevens and Roy P. This diagram shows the relative percentage of waking hours that people across the lifespan spend in formal educational environments. And other activities, with an orange representing formal and the blue less formal environments. As represented by what we call the sea of blue, the time that we're out of school constitutes the majority of our waking time. And so we realize, as we're studying youth participation, that we need to understand access to learning opportunities across settings of school, but also home, online, in community centers, in libraries. And we need to understand the relationship between learning in more and less formal environments. So when do we see synergies between more and less formal environments, and when do we see disconnects? So the quantitative data from our work, and this is very consistent, I think, with some of what we've heard in this conference before, shows that most use is happening at home, not necessarily in school. And we find that the most frequent use for the most experienced producers is at home. So home is a key place where access is happening for some children. So the question about who's getting access to opportunities to engage and with what kinds of production is really interesting to us. So this came up last night too. What is it that students are actually doing? So we answer this question by collecting fairly large samples of data and asking children to tell us what they've actually been participating in terms of production. And when we look at this, we see that some activities are quite rare and some are more common. So for example, robotics is not as common as creating a website or publication activities. And in general, computational activities are less likely to be experienced than publication or artistically oriented activities. And there's lots of reasons we could talk about why this might be true. So those activities like robotics that require special expertise and tools and access to a social network are particularly likely to show big disparities in participation. Now, if you look at efforts to diversify in things like the first robotics league, it works. You do see diversity of participation, but these spaces are still not equally accessed. So one of the most important questions, I think, that we're trying to work on is what are the social practices that support the development of sustained engagement in production activities? So we know that tools and production spaces are incredibly important. We know that resources for imagination are really important. But most importantly are the social practices that maintain engagement within communities, within affinity groups. In many of the most interesting places, guiding and collaborating blend aspects of formal learning in classrooms and apprenticeships in compelling ways. And here we see Brother Mike, who is probably also in this room, there he is back there. Thank you, Brother Mike, who is actually probably one of the most amazing people who has been able to blend formal and informal guiding and collaborating in ways that engage students and allow them to sustain engagement over time. And here what we see is Brother Mike enacting a combination of guiding learners to pursue a course of study in spoken word, inviting their own contributions, and allowing them to take center stage with their original performances. Sitting side by side with the producers and mentors to reflect on their work, to critique, to revise. And we see this in other spaces in the same school in robotics, where children get an opportunity to learn to program and to design and to build. And so one of the questions that we're trying to address, and I'm not going to say a lot about this, but there's other presentations in the conference that we can talk about this. How does engagement actually evolve across time and across settings? So addressing the question of why does this matter? Why is depth of engagement important? We try to look across time longitudinally. So we've been able to, with Nicole's collaboration as well as other collaborations in California, develop technobiographies of youth where we're really trying to do case studies that map their engagement and activities across developmental time. So these are individual timelines of learners and setting. And what we're looking at and what we're really interested in is the evolution and the diversification of the ways that they become engaged with learning and production activities. We're interested in the questions of what goals for creation do we see, and how are these intentions supported and recruited and taken up or not by people in their life spaces. And so I just want to acknowledge the very extensive research team that has worked on this project, and also, of course, the funders, namely MacArthur, number one, as well as National Science Foundation and other groups. But we have some presentations that are happening. 8 a.m. tomorrow is one where you can hear a little bit more about the data.
Okay, thank you. So I'd like to invite Esther Hargittai up to the podium. So Esther is in the Department of Communication Studies at Northwestern University, where, among other things, she heads the Web Use Project, and she's involved in many, many other ventures, and I think many of us have seen her on MSNBC and in various other places as sort of a commentator, a wise commentator. So her extensive work looks at the social and policy implications of information technologies, with particular attention to how differences in internet use may contribute to social inequality. So with that said, I'll hand it over.
Thank you. So I'm going to start by saying something that the ever-wise and ever-insightful John Palfrey said earlier today as we were just informally chatting. And he said that the first thing we should mention on this panel is that there is a field whose state we can assess. And that's a big deal, because just a few years ago, there wasn't really one. And so I think we should take a moment and applaud MacArthur and each other, frankly, that we have come together and that we're able to say that there is a field. So I think that's really exciting. Anyway, so credits to John for thinking of saying that. Of that whole big digital media and learning puzzle, I work mainly on the question of skill and digital literacy. Those of you who know my work might be surprised to know that there are no numbers in this presentation. Shocking, I know. I thought instead I'd spend the few minutes I have just giving you a broader context of the work I do, and on my website you can find copies of my papers with more numbers than you'd care to see. Okay, so I'm a sociologist by training, and I'm interested in questions of social inequality, and so that's what I bring to the table here. I'm interested in general users out there. So instead of focusing on youth who are especially engaged in technology, which a lot of people in this room do, and which is, of course, a very important aspect of this research, I'm interested in how widespread the activities are that we talk about and how we can make them more widespread, recognizing that they can be very beneficial. And so I'm very interested in going out there and learning about the average user, what we could call the average user, and as part of that, understanding all sorts of aspects of people's backgrounds, for example, their socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, gender, looking at those aspects of people's backgrounds, in addition to the technical context of their uses and the social context of their uses. And what I've been arguing for about a decade now is that when we look at digital media uses, one of the things we really have to pay attention to is variations in people's skills in using digital media. And so I've focused on that quite a bit. And then I'm interested in how skill influences uses. And finally, the really big question, especially for people interested in social stratification, but also other questions. Okay, is this gonna? Yes, there we go. Oops. Well, anyway. So the idea is that the question is, do differentiated skills and differentiated uses then influence people's life chances, opportunities, people's general well-being. So I think of online activities, and most of my work has been about internet use in particular, but I think a lot of it can be expanded to other, all sorts of digital media uses. So I think of online activities as these three separate types. I think it's important to say how we think about these things, because even in this room, I think we think about something like participation in very different ways. So this is how I see activities coming together. And in terms of dimensions of skill, I'm just going to show you this very quickly, because I could talk for at least 5 minutes about each of these dimensions. But basically, as media have evolved, more and more dimensions of skill have come into play. So I've so far focused just on a couple of these, but trying to expand more and more, but it poses lots of methodological challenges, about which I'll talk later. But just to sum up, the main questions that drive my work are basically what explains differentiated skill levels, because there are significantly different skills among users, and then what explains differentiated digital media uses. And one of my main findings is that skill is an important predictor of differentiated and diverse uses. Of course, there's a circular effect going on there. The more skilled you are, the more things you do, the more things you do, the more skilled you get. Very quickly, is there a participation gap out there? We've seen all sorts of data already, and my projects also confirm this. People engage at very different levels, and these tend to be related to people's socioeconomic status, and also skill. And just a final note, in case it's not clear why we should focus on skill. So an important reason for focusing on skill is that while things like people's socioeconomic status that influence participation are harder to influence from the outside, something like skill is certainly open to potentially to intervention, whether in informal or formal settings. So that explains why focusing on skill could be a fruitful domain. So as I said, you can access, so hopefully we can go from the frowny to the smiley. Anyway, so you can access my papers on my site. Thank you.
No? Yes, okay. So next I'd like to introduce Joe Kahne, who's a professor at the School of Education at Mills College. Jos Work explores the relationship between democracy, participation, and digital media. He's previously published the results of a survey conducted with Amanda and Pew that examined gaming and civic engagement. And Joe is really interesting because he's been at the forefront of trying to develop indicators of social media use and civic engagement and public participation. And I think he'll be talking quite a bit more about that. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Heather. Do you know what I do to get it to show up on the screen? So it is open. It's not just me.
Yep. It's not you.
Okay.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah, so if anyone was wondering whether skill is relevant, it's just quite clear. Well, I want to start by saying thank you for this opportunity to talk with you and for this whole conference, which has been just an amazing opportunity to listen to and learn about a whole lot of work that's been wonderful to hear about. I also want to say that the work I'm going to share is the product of a group of us at Mills and at the University of Wisconsin, Chris Evans and Namjin Lee, who are both here, as well as Ellen Middaugh, who isn't here today. The big questions that I guess I want to start with, sort of why focus on civic and political outcomes for young people, start with a question which is really, are young people fully tapping the potential of our democratic institutions to improve the world? And I think the answer within the context of a 5-minute presentation is no. The second question, I have a whole list of these. No, the second question is new media changing in significant ways how people participate in civic and political life, and indeed what we mean by civic and political life? Yes. And then the question that really drives me, and I think a lot of us here, is, well, what do we do about that? And I think a big part of what I want to say is obviously what we have to do is we have to learn more. We have to drill down a bit so that we can understand a little better when and why and under what circumstances we get more of what we want to have happen, and perhaps avoid some of the potential risks and problems that can arise. So if we know that participation of youth, and indeed of adults as well, is often lower than we'd want, and we know that young people are deeply engaged with new media, we can ask, can youth interested in new media be mobilized to support civic and political life in the public sphere? And I'm going to talk about a slightly briefer question, or shorter, more narrow. How does voluntary online participation relate to civic and political participation? Really asking in many respects, in what ways do informal uses of new media bridge, and when do they connect to the civic and political life? Well, does the form of online participation matter? I think we all probably believe the answer is yes. In other words, we don't want to be making generic comments about the internet does this, but rather we want to be talking about under what circumstances or what forms of participation with the internet do you get certain kinds of outcomes. And so in the results I'm going to share right now, I'm going to talk about three kinds of participation, which many of you are familiar with: friendship-driven participation, non-political interest-driven participation, by which I mean things like organizing social and recreational events, being a part of online communities that focus on fans or on entertainment, on sports, and then finally, politically driven participation, and that would be, going online to get information about politics, communicating with people about your perspectives on politics, etc. We studied this by looking at 430 young people, and what's nice is we were able to find them at two periods in their life, both as either juniors or seniors in high school, and then a couple years later, right after the 2008 election. So we're able to control for their prior level of civic and political activity at the same time that we asked them how often they'd been involved in friendship-driven forms of participation, interest-driven forms, and politically driven forms. There are different hypotheses about what should happen. Some people wonder, will participation distract us from activity? In other words, will lead to sort of people are too busy to get engaged in civic and political life? Or will participation online promote activity by giving folks skills or a sense of agency, by making them available to be recruited, or by giving them an interest, and therefore get them involved more in civic and political life? And here's what we found. Politically driven participation promoted political but not civic participation. Interest-driven participation of young people promoted civic as well as some forms of political participation, but neither of those two were related to whether or not young people voted. In other words, if we asked about the intention to vote when they were high school students, that predicted whether they ultimately did vote, but these other two forms of participation didn't add anything to our ability to predict. Some friendship-driven forms of participation appeared to promote voting, but there was no relationship between friendship-driven participation and any of our other measures of civic or political participation. So, can youth interest in online participation be mobilized? I think the answer is probably, but we'll have to be intentional about what we do, and obviously a part of what we want to do is drill down deeper to understand when and why these forms of participation matter, how equitably they're distributed among the population, and what kinds of things can we do to actually promote them. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Joe. So next I'd like to introduce Kevin Leander, who is in the Department of Teaching and Learning at Vanderbilt University. Kevin's work explores the relationship between literacies, including emergent digital literacies, and space and time. And his work has been particularly innovative for its detailed observations of youth practice, and I personally appreciate that he's working in contexts outside the U.S. With migrants and looking at their new media practices.
Like the others, I want to thank the conference organizers. I want to thank Mimi and Heather and the others for all the work on this great conference. I want to say that whoever made off with the digital textile hair flower from the session I was just in, I do want a copy of that. And also want to say that most of my studies have involved research where n equals 2 to 8 people. And so if you find a total of the 30 people that I've studied, I do stand by my claims. I apologize that this is a little bit scripted, but it was a way for me to make it through the 5 minutes without getting too distracted, which I tend to do. So first of all, I have 3 problems and then some pictures. So for some time I've been invested in how to continue to develop a distributed perspective on learning and identity, or what we might call a geographical perspective, a perspective that is adequate to the times, to the media, and to the mobilities of the lives of socially diverse youth and adults. Ethnography is still undergoing a transition from site-based analyses to analysis of flows and networks. Here are 2 images produced by Rogers Hall I'm working with at Vanderbilt on a project. And if you look at the image on the left, the spatial imagination of a research site is represented in this image by the location, for instance, of a home of a young adolescent girl, a map-like location. We might think of a different kind of map, though, while the image on the right represents the daily round of that same girl as she moves across space and time. The peaks in that image represent densities of time spent at home, school, and elsewhere. Time geography raises all kinds of questions for digital learning. What are the hot spots for learning? Where do we spend a lot of time but learn little? We talk about anywhere, anytime learning, but why are specific places hot spots for learning and others are not? The next image is of instant messaging networks in a town, and how are learning opportunities in such a network distributed and connected in social space. We could, for instance, consider the digital divide in terms of how access is provided to individuals, but we might also consider how human geographies are reproduced and newly produced in the digital. This map from my Synchrony project represents how neighborhoods separated in physical space but sharing class characteristics are connected through youth instant messaging. Also, what you see is a kind of smoothing of class spaces where you skip over the poorest section of the town and reconnect the middle class or wealthier sections of this particular town. Well, this diagram, taken from research with colleagues in the Netherlands, expresses a certain distribution of culture. This is from one Moroccan adolescent youth social networking site, what they call Hives in this case, and it signifies her group memberships. The interesting thing about these images are the contrasting groups this girl shows. For instance, food preferences. Global junk food like McDonald's is contrasted with being a Moroccan tea junkie and being fond of the Moroccan and Turkish kitchen. A demand for respect for wearing a headscarf is connected with a community such as Moroccan male hotties and Moroccans with brains. Brand preferences such as an H&M and preferences for wearing skinny pants can be found as well as attachments to traditional Moroccan dresses. Hijab style and Islam equals peace and I love Holland also go together, as well as choosing for freedom and the statement women are in charge. Pels and Dahan emphasize that especially Dutch Moroccan girls have to negotiate between opposite motivations of continuity and change. A second key topic of my work has been helping to develop a more robust understanding of the body and learning that is not trapped by a mindset of critical rationality, an understanding that includes the digital body, but does so in a way that does not leave meat space behind. Our understandings of learning are constrained or enabled by our current ontologies, our current capacities to imagine how taking a glow juice trap out of one's virtual inventory while battling a rabid showput is messing with sign-body-sign relations in ways that don't always fit traditional accounts of mediated action. How do sign-body-sign monsters learn? And how might theory move beyond sign-body and mind-body dichotomies in learning to understand learning engagements? When Lee dresses in Naruto costume accessories, an analysis of engagement in swordplay that focuses on texts and tools alone leaves us cold. In this project, with my friend Gail Bolt, drawing from the work of Deleuze and Guattari, Masumi, and others, we're creating an account of what emerges when we attend to bodies and the energies and movements in new literacies and digital practices. How can we understand such engagements of the body, where the body laughs and moves and becomes excited or shrinks, without killing them with research rationality? A third area of inquiry for me, and I'm probably at about time, but I'll try to move fast. A third area of inquiry for me involves understanding spatial thinking and how such thinking is embodied. through an NSF grant with Rogers Hall, we're looking at, and doctoral students at Vanderbilt, we're engaged in studying new forms of spatial analysis and modeling, including their presence in new media. For example, when John King moves his enormous hands over the surface of his magic map and rescales Missouri such that county-level voting patterns are now colorized, or when he taps and shifts back 4 years, then 8, new forms of spatial thinking are being enacted, new forms of understanding ourselves sociopolitically. Memorizing the state capitals and geography won't help you with these new media performances, and they also won't help you if your career trajectory takes you along to a number of places increasingly reliant on GIS technologies and spatial modeling and analysis, including this AirMed Control Center that we're studying, where communicators guide ambulance helicopters to accident destinations and back to the hospital. In these forms of activity, they coordinate GIS-enabled map data with radio and phone communication, with patient information, with in-room talk, and with a broad range of print and digital information sources, including looking out the window for approaching helicopters. Case studies such as this and others by the Space Learning and Mobility Group at Vanderbilt hope to provide important information concerning spatial learning and will be used for youth and new designs for learning. This slide provides a quick summary and also provides contact information if you would like more information to find me or associated projects. I look forward to our ongoing conversations in this session and beyond. And if you speak Dutch, we're looking for a postdoc.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. So I'd like to invite our last presenter, Lynn Schofield Clark, who is at the Oslo International Center for Journalism and New Media at University of Denver. Lynn's work is really focused on youth media, new media, at home and in families, and she uses primarily qualitative methods. But I just wanted to mention that in addition to her research, when we were writing the Digital Youth book, we really found her co-authored book with Stuart Hoover and Diane Alters, Media, Home and Family, to be really useful as an alternative model of collaborative writing of really large-scale projects. So.
Well, thank you very much, Heather, and thank you, Mimi. And this has just been such a stimulating conference, and I'm so happy to be here. So thank you very much for all the panelists as well. It's just really an honor to be up on stage with all of these folks. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the research that I've been doing. Whoops, let's see here. Got to get it on the right thing here. Okay. Some research that, and we use the same slide, I think, Joe. Parenting in a digital age. For the past 12 years, I've been engaged in research with families, differently defined, I guess, including families that are single parent, same-sex, blended, married, unmarried, various races, ethnicities, socioeconomic status. Probably the thing that defines the family that my research team and I have been studying is multi-generational group that shares a household and that has economically dependent young people in it. And so for that time, over the past 12 years, my research team and I have interviewed about 600 or so people and have been involved in various observations of families to try to understand how digital and mobile media are changing family life and how families are negotiating about the digital and mobile media that are part of their lives. Now, when I started the research, I was PK, pre-kids, and actually I wasn't sure that I wanted to have kids. I considered myself a progressive, and everybody knows that when you're a white middle-class woman like me and you have kids, you become that. And so so I was concerned about becoming a person who would be anxious and worry about my children all the time and notice how digital and mobile media would heighten the anxiety. But actually, when I was in graduate school, one of my male colleagues said to me that I shouldn't worry because, he said, having kids would actually make me a better social scientist. And I don't know whether that's a comment on the value of having children or my lack of ability as a social scientist at the time, but I did decide to go ahead and have children myself, which has shaped some of my research in recent years. Now I do have 2 preteens that live in my house, 2 collaborators on my research and other aspects of my family life. And so did I become a conservative, convinced that digital media pose dangers? Well, actually, obviously not, or I wouldn't be at this conference. So, and I'm not really sure if my male colleague was correct that it made me a better social scientist to have children. But I do know that doing research among parents and among you all who are doing this kind of innovative research about what it takes to create a child-centered environment and what that looks like in a home environment has certainly made me a better parent. And so that's become really important to the focus of my research that I've been doing in recent years. And I've seen in the families that I've been studying the emergence of families that have been able to manage to create a child-centered environment where they're focused on using digital and mobile media to give young people responsibility and to scaffold them to various aspects of new media. And so we now have the emergence of what I would call the Guitar Hero mom. So where moms and other parents have become engaged in being able to use digital and mobile media not only as a source of anxiety but as a source of fun and pleasure. And what's important here, I think, is not just that what we're learning from games together, but that as families we're learning to put the young person's expertise in the center and being able to figure out ways to think about young people who then can be the leaders and we can follow their own interests and take a different role. Now, this actually is a position that shares some common ground with some of the things that have been happening in sociology of the family research in recent years. Some of you may be familiar with the work of Arlie Hochschild and Annette Leroux and other folks who have been looking at the changing gender roles, changing nature of authority relations that are happening in the U.S. family. 150 to 200 years ago, children would leave the home when they were 11 or 12 years old into situations of indentured servitude or slavery or arranged marriage and childbearing. Now, we have our children for much longer, and we as parents then have the opportunity to be with them as they're going through the experience of separation and autonomy. And so parenting, as a result, has changed quite a bit over the past 100 years. We've moved from adults that see parenting as something that's strict, controlling, and adult-oriented to something that's child-centered, flexible, and empowering. And so what I've been able to see in terms of my own research is to kind of move toward a more transformative research position where I'm interested in what is as well as what could be. And what I want to do is show what it looks like when families embrace giving young people the freedom to experiment and express, to have high expectations and to be highly responsive, and to figure out ways that we can use digital media to do that. So the key question for my research at this moment is, what does our research into digital and mobile media do to help all kinds of parents in their parenting work? There is a very big concern about risk, as Sonia Livingstone mentions in her book, and that is something that's very dominant when you talk with parents, is their concern about how to balance these concerns that they have with risk with the real potentials that we in this room know exist with digital and mobile media. But their concerns are not just about teens, and that's something that's important. To just share one poignant story that when I was talking with a young teenager and asked her what did she most want out of digital and mobile media, she said, well, actually, I think it would be nice if my mom would get off the phone when I'm playing soccer. And to me, that's one of those examples of how this is an issue at a societal level, not just at a family issue. But I think that what's really important is that parents, we know, are not fully responsible for the outcomes of their young people. That's something that Brigid and Esther's work and others here have really talked about, that we all need more support in our work. And our research needs to reinforce this. But parents still want to know what they can do. And then we have an opportunity to change the discourse, I think, from moral panics to possibility. And so I see this as a real moment of opportunity for those of us in the room, that we can begin to try to begin a conversation with parents looking to positive ways in which we can use digital and mobile media to build family systems that are able to reinforce a child-centered way of life that then makes an empowering impact on our society as well as on our young people. Thank you.
It's not on? So thank you. That was really fantastic, and I'm totally impressed with what everybody did with 5 minutes of time. I think, I particularly appreciate, all of you agreeing to do this impossible format and to, your willingness to approach this as really an effort to foster a set of conversations. And I appreciated Esther's comment about, the fact that we really are emerging as a field, and it's just somebody who has been influenced so much by the work of all these panelists that you just heard from, and the sense that we've all come from very different places, different disciplines, and that we're at a moment when the field is coalescing, I think, in some important ways, that we've found each other in this odd space of social media, which has brought us together across a lot of boundaries. And I think all of the panelists here are, in some sense, working across boundaries, working beyond our comfort zones, and reaching across qualitative and quantitative, across different contexts of inquiry. So we're going to start by just seeding a few questions that we have seated in advance, and we wanted to give every panelist an opportunity to just reflect on what you think the key problems that we should be focusing on for this emergent field are.
Should we start at that end?
I'll let you decide.
Start with me? Okay. We're starting with the problems and challenges. Okay. Okay, well, I'll start with parents then, since that's what I had talked about. I think one of the things that's happening in the lives of parents is that there are a lot of economic stresses going on right now, and at the same time, there's a collapsing going on of leisure and work boundaries, where we have parents who are working a lot more, or parents who are not working because of either chronic unemployment or illness or disability. And so we have this kind of split that's going on, but there are real tensions on the part of adults who have to manage the various economic demands of their family life with the demands that are the emotional labor, what Arlie Hochschild calls the emotional labor of family life, which has to do with helping young people think about not only what they should, or talking with young people not only about what parents think young people should do, but focusing on how we can have these conversations and thinking about how we can be more empowering in our discussions. And I do see that there are some opportunities for the people here as educators to begin to think about what parents bring to the table and what they want in terms of their own demands and their own on their own lives, and how educators then can feed into the parental anxieties in a way that helps them to become collaborators with us in the project of education and learning. And so I think, I was actually talking with Kimberly Scott, who I think is hopefully here somewhere, about her project. I think that's a really interesting model about how universities can offer, in her case, her university offers an opportunity for young people to participate in a program in digital learning, and then offers an opportunity for parents to come to learning as well. And so when the parents are engaged in the learning as well, that gives them incentive, because if they engage in that learning, then their kid has a space saved for them at the university. And so that's an interesting way that I think universities could partner with parents by trying to figure out what parents really want, and ultimately, and how then we can help to meet their needs.
So I think one of the key questions for me right now, and because of a project that I'm involved in, involves immigration. And I'm particularly interested in immigration, both theoretically and empirically. I think it's just very significant in terms of what patterns of socialization and identity do we see that immigrants are experiencing. And I think it's particularly an important area of work to do comparative work on from different countries and different immigrant groups in order to understand if there is a sort of identity cosmopolitanism among youth, and if so, how it's connected to other forms of nationalisms, group identifications, and to forms of learning and socialization in different generations. So that's one problem area that I would indicate. The second one, and I guess this was probably pretty clear from my first 5 minutes, is about method, really about studying learning as being distributed across large social systems, as being distributed across time, as involving rhythms, as involving places and spaces of learning that are difficult to study, and also thinking about how we can use new technologies, GIS, GPS technologies, and different methods, including experience sampling, including ethnographic methods and other methods, in order to get at experiences with new digital technologies and how those digital technologies are knit to face-to-face realities or not, or how they're held apart. So that would be the secondary that I think there's a lot of work to be done, and some very interesting work that's been done already.
So I'll talk about skills some more. So let's assume that we agreed that it would be preferable to have people achieve higher level skills, especially those who are being left behind. I don't think that's too controversial. So even if we were to agree on that, and even if we decided to spend some funds towards that, there's actually a huge challenge in that we don't really know how to achieve higher level skills for digital media per se. If it was in the informal learning environment, I think there are probably good examples out there that are working, but how do we get the word out about them? How do we scale up, basically? If it were to happen in a more formal learning environment, that poses, well, that's a much bigger if, but that poses huge challenges itself. Where do you introduce something like this into the curriculum at whatever level of education? It's not at all clear. Who does the teaching? It's not clear that we even have people to do the teaching for this. So that, I think, is a huge challenge. And part of the challenge is the fact that we are also still lacking adequate measures to really assess people's skill levels. I mean, it's something I've been working on a lot, and I've certainly developed some measures for this. But as I mentioned, the dimensions keep increasing, and the skills and the measures we develop can only be generalized so much across the different dimensions. So I think we have a pretty serious methodological challenge there as well.
And so the challenges that I see actually just play quite nicely off of Esther's. So from my perspective, one of the challenges that we face in our research all the time is kind of constantly keeping up with technological developments and how to know what to measure next, how to prepare to measure what is coming next by potentially asking questions early enough. I mean, one of the things for me that's always so shocking is going back and looking at one of the first surveys we did with Pew, actually not that long ago, in which we talked about the instant messaging generation. Do we talk about instant messaging anymore? No. I mean, so I think, and that was maybe 5 years ago. So I think that's a real challenge. And then a part of that also actually comes out of some of the findings that I presented earlier, which is this idea of trying to understand when we see movements in use of technologies and in use of participation, particularly I'm thinking about the content creation numbers that I presented earlier. Do we see this decline or flattening in some of these activities as a symptom of individuals' desire to use these and engagement with these? Do we see it as something that, I mean, against this technological determinism versus sort of individual interest, but do we see this as basically a symptom of the fact that the technology itself is presenting opportunities in different ways, such that if it's not in front of you, if it's not easy as a user, does that suddenly mean that the kinds of technologies and the kinds of ways in which you use the technology change and are different? And what does that then mean for us, for those who want to encourage particular uses of technology for their informal or for their sort of expressive opportunities? What does that mean for what kinds of applications we should be designing and the ways in which we should be talking with people who are developing these actual applications in terms of the kinds of things that they might make available to the users? So
I guess I would start by saying I think we have a good sense that the quantity of media use is fine, but the quality or qualities of that use is not always what we'd want. And it isn't always what we'd want for all young people. So I guess one of the big problems that I see and one of the big questions for us all is how do we promote more of what we'd like to see? I think, for example, a lot of papers at this conference have highlighted the value of varied forms of interest-driven engagement or participation with media. But I think we also know that it's actually a small percentage of young people who engage in those ways with media frequently. How can we promote more of that? I think we all know that the access to information in media through media is enormous, but it isn't clear that young people are necessarily better informed. So, or that adults are, for that matter. I think it's key for us to think about how do we help young people engage critically to tap the full potential of what's there and to avoid some of the risks.
Thank you, Lynn, for going first. So I guess what I would say, this really builds on, I think, some of the earlier comments. I think that we need to expand the unit of analysis and change the way, in fact, that we're talking about participation and use, because it's really, really clear when you look at the data. There's so much variability that relates to a child's personal social network. Mm-hmm. And even talking about categories, which I think it is useful to do, whether it's gender or race or socioeconomic status, we need to get more complicated in how we're talking about it, because there's so much variety of activity, and it's so linked to a personal friendship, to a personal social network, to what parents do in their work, or if they happen to end up in a school like Nicole's that is just an incredible hothouse of innovation and creativity. And so that's one thing I would say is we've got to figure out a way that we're paying as much attention to the environments as to the individual levels of participation and characteristics that are associated with individuals. And if we do that, I think what we're going to start seeing, and we certainly have seen it in our data, is that it's the level of engagement is so linked to the social network that you happen to be involved in that it gives us some real power in terms of policy, I think, to say we need to have more environments that offer the kinds of opportunities that engage children's imagination, activity, and their interests, which of course are going to ebb and flow over time, but that do have really important outcomes. And my guess is not only for knowledge, but also just personal well-being and participation in civic engagement kinds of activities down the line. So that's one thing that I would say, that I think we need to really be careful about the way that we're talking and also expand our theoretical language. The second thing, the major area that I see as being an area of potential, is to really study those practices that we see are working in those hothouse kinds of environments. And many people in this room have those environments themselves, or they have been studying them. I'm looking at Elizabeth Soap, who works in youth radio, who's done wonderful ethnographies. I think that there's potential, the work of Nicole. We need to capture those practices in their full interactional complexity and start being able to say, well, what is happening here? Because you can look at outcomes, but it's the process that we need to understand more about, the guiding, the collaborating, the ways that inspiration gets developed and nurtured. So I think those are two big areas. I mean, the third, obviously, is assessment. What do we care about assessing, right? What's the most important thing? So are we finding that students who engage in participatory production activity get better at being able to collaborate? That would be an interesting, powerful finding, right? Collaboration's huge. It's really challenging to measure. We can ask about valuing collaboration. There are methods to study collaboration and performance, but I don't think we're there yet. But I think if we had some of these outcomes, if we could decide which ones are worth investing in, I think that would be also powerful for being able to speak to a broader audience of why this is important.
Thank you. I think this has given sort of a fabulous overview of some of the diverse approaches, methods, and challenges and opportunity areas that we're grappling with as a field. I just wanted to highlight the fact that we are dealing with a field of incredible complexity just because of the diversity of sites that we have to look at, which I think many of our panelists commented on, both at the research and the intervention layer. And that's why I'm hoping that these kinds of conversations are catalyzing not only reflection on specific research projects, but the networks between them, because studying new media practices, learning, technology development really requires us to come at it from multiple different sites and perspectives and approaches, which I think the diversity of approaches and perspectives on this panel really highlighted. So I think in the interest of time, we will forego the second question and open it up to the audience for questions.
So I'm interested in posing a question that involves another layer of complexity. And I don't have a specific question for any one of you with regard to topic, but I'm interested to hear from your perspective, if you change the scope of the problem to being global rather than domestic in terms of policy, in terms of your research subjects and methodologies. What do you think the interesting questions with that scope, what do they become? Do they change for you?
I think for me they're actually quite similar. I've thought about that, and there are colleagues I talk to internationally, and I think there's skill differences everywhere. I don't think you're going to find a country where you don't have skill differences among people. I mean, I can't back that up empirically because not every country has studied this, but I think there might be extra layers of complexity in that in certain contexts you're going to have less availability of technology, so you actually you're starting with less, so you're probably going to have even larger variance in skill. But I actually think my questions and challenges and issues transfer pretty well, unfortunately.
I would say that in the work that I do, from what I know about other work that's already been done that's similar, and ethnographic work on some of my basic research questions, which are really, we're about very basic measurement, but I think there are some, for us, I don't think, for instance, that Pew Internet surveys could be taken and translated to be used in other countries at all. I think a lot of the context of use in other countries is so different in terms of, already having leapfrog to mobile phone use and different perspectives on how you make phone calls, different expectations about whether a cell phone is going to be operational or not, and whether you would leave a voicemail. I think there's so many different layers that I wouldn't even really know where to begin, and I would never undertake anything without an in-country researcher as a partner.
We're facing exactly that issue now in thinking about how do you translate survey design and research design for targeted for Moroccan and Turkish immigrant youth in Holland to studying Mexican immigrants in the U.S. South. Because the comparative work seems really compelling, but you just can't do the language translation.
Yeah, I guess I'd say, there certainly are there's some overlap that is important, but there are huge differences when you're talking about civic and political engagement in different countries. I think sort of obviously, you can get arrested for doing all kinds of things that young people in the U.S. do without a second thought. And so the stakes are just much different. The dynamics with the government are much different. Access is much different.
The way I would answer your question, I think, is when you start thinking about international scope, the question that becomes interesting, for me anyway, is how might children's ideas of global society actually change if they are in fact interacting with people from around the world. And so we do know that in many multiplayer games, for example, there are children from many countries at the same time. And on the one hand, you might think that would lead to cultural exchange and better understanding and empathy. On the other hand, the technology sometimes seems to minimize differences so that it maybe reduces information about the other. So I think some interesting questions would be around the design of the technology and the opportunities and possibilities for thinking about how you would do things so that there would be more engagement and collaboration and maybe more cultural understanding rather than less.
I guess in terms of my research, one thing that's been interesting for me is when I was in Israel actually a couple of months ago and was talking about some of my research in parenting in the U.S. context, and it's very striking to look at some of the cultural differences as well as the issues that we've been raising here about opportunity and structure and various aspects that can mitigate against using media in informal learning. And certainly, I think it's interesting to do cross-cultural comparisons because then you can gain an insight into the various cultures and what's going on. And certainly for me, when I was presenting in Israel, it was very striking how much in the United States context, so much of our discourse about digital media is linked to our discourse as a culture of fear, and how we're kind of taught in many ways to be fearful about things and to worry about things. And so I think that may be quite different in various contexts. But I think it's a very interesting study, and I hope that there will be more comparative work done in various places. So thank you.
So I think Dan has the next question, but I did want to encourage the panelists to also feel free to pass on a question if you don't feel like you all have to answer every question because our time is very limited.
Thanks. As a junior scholar in the field, it's really inspiring to hear so many spaces for research. You know, you guys have presented just a vision of all these different places you guys can go, and hopefully that creates a lot of space for the rest of us. So one of the areas I was thinking about going actually is not to the future, but into the past. And I haven't heard anybody really talk about history. So I'm kind of curious, maybe I was told to direct the question at a couple people. So maybe Lynn, Kevin, or Joe, what is the role maybe of history in your research? Where could it go? Have you guys thought about using kind of historical analysis, historical research? I don't know. Is there a future for history in this field? So that's my question.
Well, I think I could start with that just by I'm teaching a class right now actually called Innovations in Media Communication, and it was the media history class. And so now what that class is about is we start with college students thinking about, okay, we're in the midst of this internet revolution and everything's different, and so now let's look back at older revolutions. How is this like and not like what happened in the printing press, and how is this like and not like what happened when the telegraph was introduced? And so I think it's very interesting to do historical comparisons to some extent too, because that will help us to shed light on the specific moment. I think there's a tendency for us to feel really like everything's brand new and it's never been like this before. But historians can help us to sort out what is actually new here and what are some of the things that are continuations, and they can help to remind us that it isn't just about the technology, that it really is about social practice, and technology is not a thing. It's linked to practice, as Bruno Latour has talked about. And so in that sense, we have a responsibility as well to learn from history and to take it forward in our practices.
So, yeah. No, I think that is right. I think there are lots of, for example, Amanda and I did a big project on games and civic engagement. There were lots of games developed in this past century and even before, explicitly designed to do the same kinds of things we were talking about today, with simulations, with role-playing around running a nation, all kinds of stuff that's being done now online, but certainly has been done in the past.
So I wanted to pick up this question about methods, and it's certainly interesting because there's a wide variety of field sites, and this is something to which was already alluded, that have been addressed with sort of a panoply of methods, and everything from statistical modeling to ethnographic studies to whatever else. And I want to ask if there might be, as this field becomes a field, is there potential conflict between these methods that sort of have different epistemological assumptions about how you go about producing knowledge and how you know something? Is there a potential problem of drawing these methods together, or does it create opportunities for productive dialogue of how we go about producing viable, actionable knowledge? And that's not directed at any particular panelist. Anyone who's particularly excited about it is welcome to respond.
I use Joe's method. Yes, yes, no. That was a great series of questions, but I'm not sure that I can remember them all. Yes, I do think there are conflicts, and I think that conflict is very productive. And I think, I'm just thinking about this conference, and I think that the idea also of not necessarily conflict, but it's not just research methodologies, but this contact zone between people who are doing design, people who are emphasizing pedagogy, people who are doing research, and thinking about the research as design or as pedagogy. That contact, I think, is exceptionally productive too. I think, for me, one of the things that we have an opportunity to do is to not recreate the Institute of Educational Sciences in digital media, right? And so it doesn't mean that the methodologies of IES are not valid here and not significant and important. It just means that we have an opportunity to create a bigger perspective. And that would include, I think, scholars in this room that are trained in the humanities and bring theoretical perspectives that are so incredibly rich, and yet they need data too. And so I think those kind of crossovers are incredibly productive.
For providing a corrective to my one big happy family network narrative. It's important. I think this is going to be our last question.
Oh gosh, pressure. So I think income and wealth is one imperfect, but one measure of who has access to the rewards of society, however we want to phrase that. And if you look in the United States context and perhaps internationally, maybe over the last 30 years or so, we've seen an increasingly widening gap between the richest of the rich and the poorest of the poor. And definitely we've had discussions about digital divides over the last 20 years in particular. So based on the research that you all have done, whoever wishes to answer the question, do you see digital media and the way that it's being used for learning as something that is going to exacerbate this gap, decrease this gap, or will it have any impact at all?
I guess this is my... Others are welcome to answer, of course, but I've been working on this for, as long as I've been working on this topic. So I don't think we really know the answer. I'd say that because we just don't have enough empirical work on this at a level that would allow us to really know what's happening. But the way I've approached it is that there are three possibilities. One is, you mentioned two. I think there are three. One is that those who are less privileged improve their situation at a higher slope or deeper slope than those who are more privileged, and so they start converging, and so the differences actually decrease. That would be a positive outcome, I guess, depending on your ideological stance. If the slope is similar, then nothing changes, which is possible. And if the slopes are different in the other way, then we have increased inequality. Again, I don't think we have the data yet to suggest what's really happening. I'm a little discouraged by the little data we do have, and I keep arguing that if we don't pay attention, I think there is very much the potential that those who are less privileged will become even less privileged, because those who are more privileged are the ones who are truly benefiting from the opportunities. But again, we still need more data to really know what's happening.
I would also say that some of the data that I've seen recently that also plays into what Craig was talking about last night about in his case, he was talking about how working with basically Latino and African American sort of working class youth and seeing them use sort of workarounds from basically not being able to have some of this access that other people have to the kind of information and knowledge, and then using what they had, which is the cell phone, to actually get access to it through a different way. And so I think we need to, first of all, be sure we're paying attention to as much broadly to as much different ways of getting, basically don't just privilege the kind of standard way of accessing information, the standard way of participating and creating, but be sure that we're looking broadly at what's going on to watch and find some of these workarounds and these different ways of getting access, these different ways of use. So I'm actually maybe a little bit more positive about what the future holds than Esther is in that regard.
Thank you. I hope you all join me in thanking the panelists for a fabulous session. And the buses will be leaving at 6:45, 6:50, so you have a few minutes.